What's happening up there is a disgrace. It's a disgrace. Billions of dollars have been stolen. Billions sent back to Somalia.
A shocking courtroom decision in Minnesota is now raising serious questions about justice and accountability in the U.S. In a move experts say almost never happens, a judge overturned a unanimous jury verdict in a massive $7.2 million Medicaid fraud case.
For years, the courthouse in central Minnesota stood as a symbol of order. A place where disputes were settled, records were signed, and authority carried weight. On most mornings it opened quietly, its routines unchanged. No one arriving that day expected it to become the focus of a federal arrest. The shift happened without warning. Federal agents entered the building with a warrant tied to a long-running investigation into Medicaid fraud and narcotics trafficking. Their target was not a defendant waiting in the hallway or a name buried in a case file. It was a sitting judge, someone whose role was to uphold the law, now facing allegations that placed him at the center of a sprawling criminal network. According to investigators, the case began years earlier with irregular Medicaid billing patterns that appeared small at first. Individual claims that didn't quite align. Providers linked through distant connections. Payments approved without the usual documentation. Nothing that triggered immediate alarms, but enough to register as unusual when viewed over time. Analysts started quietly collecting data. As billing records were reviewed, the same names surfaced again and again. Clinics tied together by shared administrators. Vendors rotating through the same accounts. Payments structured just below reporting thresholds. The amounts grew steadily, eventually totaling more than $7 million in questioned Medicaid reimbursements. At that stage, the investigation was still financial. Fraud, on its own, was serious but familiar territory. What changed everything was a separate inquiry moving through federal drug enforcement channels. Agents tracking narcotics distribution in the Midwest began mapping supply routes connected to a synthetic drug pipeline. Shipments appeared in unexpected places. Storage facilities with no clear purpose. Transfers logged under shell companies that had no physical operations. As the network was charted, analysts noticed something troubling. Several of the same financial entities flagged in the Medicaid review were appearing again, now tied to drug-related logistics. The overlap could not be ignored. Joint task forces were formed quietly, sharing information without alerting the subjects under review. Financial crimes units compared ledgers with seizure reports. Phone records were matched against court schedules. Travel data was cross-checked with shipment timelines. Slowly, a picture began to take shape. Investigators alleged that the Medicaid fraud operation was not isolated. It functioned as a funding mechanism, generating clean money that could be moved through legitimate channels. That money, they believed, supported a parallel network responsible for moving large quantities of narcotics across state lines. The scale shocked even seasoned agents. According to federal estimates, more than 6 tons of drugs were connected to the network under investigation. Quantities large enough to supply multiple regions. Distribution that relied on coordination, protection, and access. Access that, investigators said, may have been reinforced by influence inside the legal system itself. Attention turned back to the courthouse. Records showed a pattern of rulings that consistently benefited entities later linked to the investigation. Cases dismissed on procedural grounds. Seized assets released early. Warrants challenged successfully when they should not have been. Individually, each decision could be defended. Taken together, they formed a pattern that raised serious questions. Still, federal officials moved cautiously. Allegations involving judicial figures demanded precision. Surveillance was expanded. Communications were monitored. Financial flows were traced further back. Every step was documented, reviewed, and verified. The arrest, when it came, was deliberate. Agents approached the judge without spectacle. No press conference. No public confrontation. Just a warrant served and custody established. By the time word spread, the individual had already been removed from the courthouse and transported for questioning. For the public, the news landed hard. A judge accused of playing a role in both Medicaid fraud and a massive drug network challenged assumptions about where corruption could exist. For investigators, it confirmed something they had long suspected. This case was not about a single official or a single crime. It was about how systems could be manipulated from the inside, quietly, over time. And what had begun as a review of billing records was now opening into something far larger than anyone had expected. Once the arrest was complete, the investigation moved into a phase that agents described as both methodical and urgent. With a central figure now in custody, There was a narrow window to secure evidence before anyone connected to the network could react. Financial analysts worked first. Bank records tied to the Medicaid case were pulled in full, extending years beyond the initial review. What emerged was a layered system designed to appear routine. Clinics billed for legitimate services, but the volume never quite matched staffing levels. Equipment purchases were logged, but inventories did not reflect them. Payments flowed through multiple intermediary accounts before settling in businesses that appeared unrelated on paper. Those businesses became the next focus. Some were real. Small transportation firms, property management companies, consulting groups that claimed to offer administrative support. Others existed only as legal entities, registered at addresses that housed dozens of similar companies. Each one served a purpose, moving money just far enough to blur its origin. Federal investigators identified more than 30 such entities connected to the case. At the same time, drug enforcement teams expanded their review of seizure data across the Midwest. What they found aligned closely with the financial picture. Large quantities of narcotics were being intercepted along routes that corresponded with payments flagged in the Medicaid records. Storage locations appeared shortly after certain reimbursements cleared. Vehicles used in drug transport were leased through companies tied to the same financial web. The coordination was precise. Agents concluded that the network operated on two synchronized tracks. One generated revenue through fraudulent medical claims. The other used that revenue to support logistics, transportation, and protection for drug distribution. Each track reinforced the other, creating a system that could operate without drawing attention to either side on its own. Attention turned again to the judge's role. Court records were examined in detail. Investigators noted repeated interventions in cases involving entities now under scrutiny. Motions were granted with unusual speed. Evidence challenges succeeded where precedent suggested they should not. In asset forfeiture cases, seized property was returned quickly, sometimes without full hearings. Former court staff were interviewed quietly. Most described the judge as professional and careful. But a few recalled moments that, in hindsight, felt out of place. Sudden schedule changes. Closed-door meetings with unfamiliar attorneys. Instructions to prioritize certain filings without explanation. None of it proved misconduct by itself. Together it raised alarms. As federal teams worked through the material, they uncovered communications that suggested coordination beyond Minnesota. Encrypted messages referenced shipments timed around court dates. Payments released days after favorable rulings. Travel records showed the judge attending conferences in cities that later appeared as distribution hubs in drug cases. The pattern was tightening. By this point, investigators estimated that more than $7.2 million in Medicaid funds had been improperly obtained. That figure reflected only confirmed transactions. Analysts warned that additional losses could surface as more records were reviewed. The drug side of the operation appeared even larger, with federal estimates linking more than 6 tons of narcotics to the broader network. 4 agents involved in the case, the challenge was no longer proving scale. It was proving intent. Every connection had to be documented. Every inference supported by evidence. Judicial cases demanded an extraordinary level of scrutiny, and federal prosecutors made clear that speculation would not survive in court. Teams were instructed to double-check timelines, verify sources, and eliminate assumptions. Meanwhile, signs emerged that others connected to the operation were becoming aware of the investigation. Phones went dark. Accounts were drained and closed. Vehicles tied to earlier surveillance disappeared from known locations. A handful of individuals left the state without notice. That movement accelerated the response. Search warrants were executed at multiple locations within days of the arrest. Offices were cleared. Storage units were opened. Digital records were seized before they could be erased. Each action revealed more of the network's internal structure, from payment schedules to delivery coordination. Investigators also began to see how the network insulated itself. Decisions were compartmentalized. Couriers did not know financiers. Administrators did not handle drugs directly. Layers existed to protect leadership from exposure. But with the arrest of a judicial figure, that protection was breaking down. Inside federal briefings, one assessment became common. This was not a rogue operation that grew unchecked. It was a system that relied on credibility, medical legitimacy, legal authority, familiar institutions. Those elements allowed it to function longer than most criminal networks ever could. As evidence continued to surface, prosecutors prepared for a case that would test public trust as much as legal standards. The investigation was no longer just about fraud or drugs. It was about how deeply influence could reach when the safeguards meant to prevent abuse were quietly bypassed. And as agents pressed forward, they understood something else clearly. What they had uncovered so far was likely only part of the story. With the financial structure mapped and key figures identified, federal teams shifted their attention to the physical side of the operation. The question was no longer whether a drug network existed, but how it moved such large quantities without triggering immediate detection. The answer emerged through logistics. Investigators reconstructed shipment routes using toll data, license plate readers, and commercial leasing records. Trucks registered to small freight companies traveled predictable corridors across the Midwest, rarely deviating from scheduled patterns. Loads moved at night, timed to arrive at storage locations shortly before dawn. The same vehicles returned empty hours later, leaving no obvious trace. Warehouses linked to the network were deliberately unremarkable. No signage. No regular employees. Utilities kept at minimal levels. In some cases, units were rented under the names of elderly relatives or shell corporations with clean records. Surveillance confirmed that access was tightly controlled. Entry times were brief. No lingering. No unnecessary movement. As agents followed the trail, they began coordinating with regional task forces. Seizure reports from neighboring states were reviewed again, this time with the Minnesota investigation in mind. Patterns aligned quickly. Packaging styles matched. Chemical markers were consistent. Distribution methods mirrored those used by established trafficking organizations. The scale became undeniable. Federal estimates tied more than 6.2 tons of narcotics to the network under investigation. That figure included fentanyl, methamphetamine, and cocaine, distributed across multiple states over an extended period. Analysts warned that the true volume could be higher, as only confirmed shipments were counted. What concerned investigators most was not just the quantity but the efficiency. Shipments moved with minimal loss. Couriers avoided law enforcement contact with discipline. Financial support ensured vehicles were well maintained and replaced quickly when needed. The operation showed none of the disorganization typical of smaller criminal groups. It functioned more like a supply chain than a street-level operation. Attention turned again to the judge's alleged role. Agents examined how court decisions intersected with enforcement efforts. In several cases, routine traffic stops involving network vehicles resulted in charges being reduced or dismissed. In others, evidence suppression motions succeeded unexpectedly, allowing seized property to be returned. Each decision, reviewed in isolation, appeared defensible. Taken together, they formed a pattern that coincided closely with shipment timelines. Investigators believed the network relied on predictability. Knowing when enforcement pressure would ease. Knowing which challenges would succeed. Knowing when seized assets would be released. That predictability reduced risk and allowed operations to expand. Communications data added weight to that theory. Recovered devices contained references to court dates and docket numbers alongside logistics notes. Some messages appeared minutes after rulings were issued, relaying information about timing and clearance. Analysts interpreted these exchanges as confirmation that legal outcomes were being monitored and acted upon in real time. As the investigation widened, federal teams executed coordinated searches across multiple counties. Storage units were opened under warrant. Vehicles were seized. One location yielded vacuum-sealed packages stacked behind false walls. Another contained chemical precursors and pill presses, indicating on-site processing rather than simple redistribution. In one warehouse, agents discovered pallets marked as imported goods. Beneath the top layer, they found sealed containers matching those recovered in earlier seizures. Field testing confirmed the presence of fentanyl at concentrations high enough to cause mass casualties if mishandled. The risk extended beyond distribution. Investigators learned that some shipments were temporarily stored near residential areas, increasing the danger of accidental exposure. In internal briefings, agents expressed concern that a single fire or spill could have caused catastrophic harm. As evidence mounted, the network's internal communications grew tense. Intercepted messages showed rising anxiety about exposure. Instructions shifted from routine scheduling to damage control. Payments were accelerated. Assets were moved. Some couriers were told to suspend activity indefinitely. The arrest of the judge had altered the balance. For the first time, the network faced uncertainty at its core. Legal outcomes were no longer predictable. Financial channels were under scrutiny. Routes once considered safe were now compromised. That instability prompted mistakes. One such mistake led agents to a secondary coordinator operating out of a suburban office park. Surveillance captured a meeting involving multiple individuals tied to logistics and finance. Within hours, warrants were executed. Additional records were seized, including shipment manifests and internal accounting summaries that linked directly back to the Medicaid fraud operation. The pieces were converging. By the end of this phase, investigators had established a comprehensive picture of how the network functioned day to day. Fraud generated funds. Legal influence reduced risk. Logistics moved product efficiently. Each element supported the others, creating a structure that could operate longer and at greater scale than most criminal enterprises. For federal prosecutors, the challenge was now clear. They were preparing a case that spanned financial crime, narcotics trafficking, and abuse of judicial authority. Each charge required its own standard of proof. Each connection had to be airtight. And as teams continued working through the evidence, one conclusion became unavoidable. The arrest was not the climax of the case. It was the moment the operation finally began to unravel. With the logistics exposed and key nodes identified, investigators turned their attention to the money itself. Not just where it moved, but how it was cleaned, justified, and reintroduced into systems designed to trust it. The Medicaid files became central again. Auditors reconstructed billing activity month by month, comparing claims against staffing records, patient logs, and procurement data. Clinics connected to the network reported services that exceeded their capacity. Equipment purchases appeared on paper but could not be located. In some cases, patients listed as receiving treatment were found to have visited facilities that were closed on the dates claimed. The pattern was consistent. Claims were broken into smaller amounts to avoid scrutiny. Submissions were timed around reporting cycles. Appeals were filed immediately when questions arose, often accompanied by documentation that appeared complete at first glance. It was a process built to overwhelm oversight rather than evade it outright. Investigators identified internal notes suggesting that certain claims were expected to pass without review. Those expectations aligned closely with periods when court challenges to enforcement actions succeeded unusually quickly. The timing was difficult to dismiss. As the financial review deepened, prosecutors began preparing parallel cases. One focused on fraud and restitution. Another targeted money laundering. A third examined obstruction and abuse of public office. Each track required its own evidence, its own witnesses, and its own timeline. Former employees of the clinics were interviewed under subpoena. Some described pressure to submit claims they did not understand. Others said they were instructed to backdate records or reuse templates for patient files. A few admitted they had raised concerns, only to be told the issues had been handled at a higher level. That phrase appeared more than once. Meanwhile, narcotics analysts assessed the downstream impact of the drug distribution tied to the network. Seizure reports were cross-referenced with overdose data. The overlap was striking. Counterfeit pills recovered during raids matched pills documented at fatal scenes. Chemical signatures were consistent across counties, linking deaths separated by miles to the same supply source. Emergency responders provided testimony that reinforced the scale. Calls spiked following periods when shipments were believed to have moved through the region. In one 6-week window, overdose incidents increased sharply in neighborhoods connected to earlier surveillance. Investigators concluded that the network's activity had a direct and measurable effect on public health. As evidence mounted, attention turned to accountability within institutions. Oversight bodies began reviewing how the fraudulent claims had passed initial checks. Internal controls were examined. Audit thresholds were reassessed. Officials acknowledged that systems designed to prevent abuse had been stretched thin, relying heavily on automated reviews and trust in professional credentials. The presence of judicial influence complicated that trust. Prosecutors outlined how perceived legal protection could embolden a network. When enforcement actions failed or assets were returned, it signaled safety. That signal encouraged expansion. More claims. Larger shipments. Greater risk taken with less fear of consequence. In internal briefings, agents described the operation as a feedback loop. Fraud funded distribution. Distribution generated profit. Influence reduced pressure. Reduced pressure allowed growth. Each element reinforced the next. The human cost remained central. Families affected by addiction shared statements describing sudden losses. Parents spoke of children who believed they were taking prescription medication. Employers described workers who never returned from lunch breaks. The testimonies were not used for spectacle but to establish impact. This was not abstract harm. It was measurable, personal, and ongoing. As indictments were drafted, investigators also prepared for resistance. Defense teams challenged timelines, questioned intent, and attempted to separate financial misconduct from drug trafficking. Prosecutors responded by tightening their narrative, linking actions through documentation rather than inference. Digital forensics played a critical role. Recovered devices revealed calendars synced with billing cycles and shipment windows. Notes referenced clear weeks and quiet days, language investigators interpreted as periods of reduced enforcement risk. Payment schedules aligned with those windows. When rulings went favorably, activity increased shortly afterward. The case file grew rapidly. By this stage, federal teams had seized properties, frozen accounts, and placed holds on businesses connected to the network. The financial impact was immediate. Operations stalled. Couriers went unpaid. Storage leases lapsed. The structure that had relied on constant movement began to fracture. Still, investigators remained cautious. They understood that dismantling a system did not guarantee it would not reform elsewhere. Networks adapt. Individuals relocate. Methods evolve. The goal was not simply to win convictions, but to disrupt the mechanisms that made the operation possible. As the final pieces were assembled, prosecutors prepared to present a case that extended beyond criminal liability. It questioned how safeguards failed, how authority was leveraged, and how long such a system could operate without detection. The answer, they believed, was already in the evidence. Long enough to cause lasting damage. As the investigation moved toward its final phase, federal officials shifted from uncovering evidence to defining consequences. What had started as a financial review and expanded into a multi-ton drug case now stood as a test of institutional accountability. Prosecutors framed the matter carefully. This was not presented as a story about one corrupted official acting alone. The filings emphasized systems, oversight gaps, layers of trust that, once exploited, allowed misconduct to persist without immediate challenge. The alleged actions of a judge carried weight not because of position alone, but because of how that position interacted with other safeguards. Court records showed how influence, once established, could alter expectations. Investigators argued that favorable rulings did more than resolve individual cases. They sent signals. Signals that reduced perceived risk and encouraged continued activity. Over time, those signals shaped behavior across the network. Federal agencies also reviewed their own processes. Medicaid administrators examined how automated reviews had been relied upon too heavily. Audit teams acknowledged that volume pressures limited manual oversight. Adjustments were announced quietly. Thresholds lowered. Cross-checks expanded. Data sharing between agencies increased. The aim was not damage control, but prevention. On the enforcement side, narcotics units assessed how the network had moved such quantities without earlier disruption. Analysts identified patterns that had been overlooked because they appeared routine. Freight routes that matched legitimate commerce. Storage locations that blended into industrial zones. Financial flows that stayed just within acceptable limits. Those findings led to new directives. Interagency coordination was formalized. Financial crimes analysts were embedded earlier in drug investigations. Judicial outcomes linked to enforcement actions were flagged automatically for review. The intent was clear. Remove predictability. Restore uncertainty where it had been abused. For the communities affected, the case carried a different weight. Public statements avoided broad accusations. Leaders stressed that accountability would be individual, not collective. Outreach focused on rebuilding trust, particularly where institutions had failed to protect. Support services expanded. Education efforts increased. The message was deliberate. Justice would not come at the cost of fairness. As the legal process advanced, defense teams challenged the scope of the allegations. Motions questioned causation, intent, and the linking of financial fraud to drug distribution. Prosecutors responded with documentation, timelines, records that aligned actions across years rather than moments. The case moved forward without spectacle. There were no sweeping claims. No declarations of final victory. Officials emphasized process, evidence, the slow work of restoring confidence in systems designed to serve the public. In internal summaries, one conclusion appeared repeatedly. What made the network dangerous was not secrecy alone. It was credibility. The ability to operate under the assumption that certain spaces were beyond suspicion. Once that assumption took hold, oversight weakened. And where oversight weakened, harm followed. The arrest marked an end to one operation. It did not mark an end to the risk. Federal investigators closed their final report with a warning grounded in experience. Systems fail not only when they are attacked, but when they are trusted without verification. Authority demands scrutiny. Process demands review. And accountability must apply equally regardless of position. The case in Minnesota exposed how far a network could reach when those principles eroded. What followed would determine whether the lessons learned remained on paper or translated into lasting change. That outcome, investigators noted, would matter far beyond a single courtroom.